Anyway, it's a great pleasure for me to be welcoming Ajahn Bingao Aramsi to campus once again. So, for her background, she did her BA in accounting, which is kind of amazing. Career trajectory. It took her a while to find enlightenment. So she did her BA in accounting at Chulalongkorn and then began her long-standing involvement with NGOs, starting to work with Project for Ecological Recovery, which is an important and well-known grassroots environmental organization in Thailand. And she did her master's at Thammasat, and it won Best Thesis Award, and it was about ecological knowledge of Karem. And then she went to the University of Washington, where she did her master's and her PhD, completing that in the year 2000. And she is now an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Chiang Mai University. Since over these years then, she's been a postdoctoral fellow at the Southeast Asian Studies program at the National University of Singapore, a Fulbright visiting fellow at University of Washington, a Harvard Yenching fellow at Harvard University, and she's got a long and distinguished career in academics, winning numerous awards for her research papers and books. But I just wanted to comment on some of her activism. I should just say her research spans a lot of different topics, so politics of nature conservation, the rights of upland minorities, border studies, development critiques, gender relations, and social movements. That's all well and good, but one of my key memories is her involvement with a bookstore known as Book Republic. And at that particular moment, they had run into trouble because they had hosted a controversial author who had written a book about King Rama VI. And so this was generating a lot of media controversy. And I happened to be visiting her at the bookstore with my son, who was then about 16 years old, as the police arrived, and they're photographing everything. And Bingao tells the police, please don't photograph the foreigners here. And I was like, if the police were coming and photographing everything in my place, would I have the presence of mind to say, please don't photograph these weirdos over here? My son later informed me that despite Bingao's best intentions, he thought we were photographed because they photographed a mirror that we were reflected in. So, but it was a noble effort nonetheless. And Bingao and I are working together on co-advising. Where is he? There he is. He can't hide. Kunchayapan Singh, otherwise known to all of us as Bak. So our plan is to torture him and make his dissertation experience as miserable as possible. And in addition to mentoring Bak and other students through their academic careers, I would be remiss if I did not mention that Bingao is known to all of her friends for her work in mentoring dogs. So she has a large collection, numerous dogs that owe their well-being to Ajahn Bingao. So, but she's not here to talk about dogs. Although I know she would be easily convinced to do so. But I'm pleased to welcome you to COTS and our Center for Southeast Asian Studies and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and to hear your talk on border and bribery and anthropology and corruption.
Thank you so much, Ajahn Kat, for your warm introduction. Actually, I did bring my dog here too. My talk to you based on this book, and I will pass around this book because one of my beloved dogs, Victor, is on the front cover of the book. So first of all, I would like to thank the Council on Thai Studies Conference and Center for Southeast Asian Studies here at UW-Madison for inviting me to this conference. This is the first time that I attend a conference, and I heard rumored a lot about this prestigious, very warm kind of conference, which is in a way quite strange for me to have a conference, in one room all through 3 days. This is something very, very unique. My talk today, border and bribery, since it is quite a sensitive issue, so all the names and locations in this talk will be in pseudonym. So including the local authorities that I will talk about. Okay. So I would like to start by, so there will be a lot of stories since I'm an anthropologist, so bear with me throughout the talk. I first went to border town A in Western Thailand in 2007 to study the state control of migrant workers through the system of ID cards. What struck me about this small town was that everywhere I went, there were talks and gossip about bribery and extortion. Migrant workers I interviewed, almost everyone encountered extortion as part of everyday life experience. An NGO staff told me that a high-ranking immigration police position there would cost as high as 7 figures. Another informant recalled a news about a policeman who was arrested for the gold shop heist. The robbery suspect later confessed that he needed money to pay a bribe in order to return to his previous position in border town A. Stories about corruption and bribery were told more often than any other subject. Yet, similar to what Shaw and Holder noted, very few anthropologists go to the field with an aim to studying corruption as such. I did not embark on an anthropological study of bribery in Town A until 2018. Part of the reason perhaps has to do with the thinking that corruption is not an anthropological field. Indeed, if we look at literatures relating to corruption, we will find very few that has been done by anthropologists. Until recently, corruption has been a subject studied by political scientists, economists, and public policy people. Many of these work share a common characteristic, a tendency to view corruption as some kind of pathology, deviant from normalcy, anti-development and modernity, that needs to be fixed by more efficient laws and transparency. A former World Bank president, James Wolfenson, coined the term cancer of corruption and called for a war against corruption during his speech at the World Bank IMF annual meeting in 1996. And we'd like to show a statement by Wolfenson here. So if you read his statement, the Orientalist overtone is unsurprising. While Third World has long been seen as a breeding ground for unmodern practices that hinder the pace of development, corruption as the Third World disease, the root cause of chronic poverty, can only be cured by the Western treatment of transparency and good governance. Since the 1990s, notion of transparency and good governance have become the key strategies worldwide employed by leading international organizations, governments, corporations, and NGOs on their road to reform and to eradicate corruption. Literatures about corruption in Thailand share a similar trope of corruption as violation of laws, modernity, development, and democracy that connotes weakness of the state and its flimsy legal enforcement. Many of this work proposes that legal reform, external auditing, transparency, and accessible complaint channel are the key to the reduction of corruption. But over 3 decades of fight against corruption, such effort has been, however, fruitless, as the rate of corruption has escalated. Yet, very few ask why it is that the only thing a reform seems to have generated is what Vanathan calls the perpetual machine of archives of reform that produces report of corruption ranking year by year that affect very little on the landscape of corruption. Anthropology might not be able to answer this tough question, but what anthropology can humbly offer is perhaps a different way of conceptualizing corruption that depart from the dominant view of pathology. While international organizations such as Transparency International define corruption as, and I quote here, the abuse of entrusted power for private gain that erodes trust, weakens democracy, hampers economic development, and further exacerbates inequality, poverty, social division, and the environmental crisis. Such reductionist, moral-driven definition tells very little about the complex relationship between corruption in a society and how corruption engages with people, not just economically, but also socially and culturally. Anthropologists and sociologists of corruption suggest alternative ways of understanding corruption. Some view corruption as a form of exchange, a polysemous and multi-stranded relationship, and part of the way in which individuals connect with the state. Indian sociologist Chief Visavanathan proposes that corruption should be viewed as a form of knowledge, defining access, a way of coding and decoding bureaucracies by pricing knowledge and access to. Anthropologist R.Q. Gupta, in his famous article entitled Blurred Boundaries, The Discourse of Corruption and the Culture of Politics and the Imagined State, brings corruption into everyday life practices that reflects the local engagement with the state at the grassroots level, the collusion that oftentimes obscures the line between the state and the society. So the everydayness of corruption allows the possibility of unraveling rules and cultural codes that govern the way corruption operates, which differs across diverse contexts. Anthropologist Kirsten Endres, in her study about bribery in Vietnam, suggests the notion of corrupt exception, in which law is made and becomes norm of exchange. So my work on border and bribery joins in with the everydayness of corruption approach pioneered by sociology and anthropology of corruption. However, I would like to expand the argument further to incorporate the complex relationship between corruption and capitalist development. Contrary to the dichotomous view by international agencies such as World Bank and Transparency International that often put corruption in opposite to the growth of capitalism in third world countries, I argue that corruption has operated as a necessity in the capitalist development. As we will see in this talk, the border town A, there are various forms of and practices of corruption in this area that have produced a contradictory effect of fixity and mobility of labor regulation and labor deregulation. A flexibility in employment that allow for both exploitation and room for maneuver that have put local officials, capitalist employers, and migrant workers into the everyday encounter. So while the border corruption weaves various actors together, the grammar of each kind of corruption also differs, bringing into play various actors, bringing into play the politics of race and class differentiation, which have been reproduced and intensified. So for migrant workers living in the social world of corruption, one has to navigate oneself through the serious game, the notion put forward by Sherry Ortman, which means acting upon the world as it is given, and in the process, make and unmake the world. So this talk will consist of several stories of bribe and extortion told by different groups of people I met while visiting the border town A, and I will end my talk with some policy implications. I'll start with the first story, the clash of time. In 2016, I took a group of undergrad students from my border studies class to visit the BG Garment Office, and this is a pseudonym, as part of the field trip in the border town A. BG Garment is one among the largest textile and apparel industry in this border town that has its headquarters in Bangkok and its other factory in Cambodia. It has been in the business for more than 40 years, producing casual and fashion dress wear for men, women, and children that serve more than 160 brands, both domestic and international. On the day of our visit, we were greeted by Mr. A, who happened to come, the owner of the industry, who happened to come to his branch in the border province during the time of our visit there. Mr. A was kind enough to offer a presentation to our group from Chiang Mai University to give an insight into the development of his transnational company. So prior to the video presentation of the BG garment industry, this owner of this textile industry, who was in his 70s, shared a story of his youth and how he worked so hard without any opportunity to enter a formal education before he could successfully find a way to establish his own firm. It was evident that the introduction part of the presentation was meant to be educational and inspiring for the young student visitors. Recalling the time when he was still an employee at a small factory in Bangkok, he told us that he would come back home each day, looking at the calendar, and cried while tearing off the page that had the current date on. And to give you some idea of what the calendar he was talking about, it is Chinese. Anyone from Sino-Thai family would know this well. So he said, and I quote here, "I cried every day because I realized that another day had passed. I couldn't do anything to stop the day from passing. I cried because I had not done enough, but the time had already fried away." End quote. Mr. A did not cry for too long. At middle age, he became a successful capitalist who knows best how to control time. Using a metaphor of a horse race, Mr. A continued his storyline about time. Being a capitalist, he said, is like a horse in a horse race. You have to run fast as you can, so you won't be in the last in the racing line and got eaten by a tiger behind you. At this point, I was looking around the table where my students were sitting. Interestingly, none of them were paying any attention to the talk. Everyone was playing on his or her own her mobile phone, idly sliding the screen to pass time. It was quite clear that Mr. A's temporal story, a tale of a successful capitalist mastering of time for somehow, failed to enter the time zone of these students. So we know that time is a significant element of capitalism. Capitalism reinvented time, transforming the eventful temporalities of social life, which are irreversible, contingent, uneven, discontinuous, and transformational, into an extreme abstraction that can be measured, standardized, and optimized. Not only the control of time, but more importantly, the acceleration of time are pivotal to the expansion of capitalism. Time is therefore not just a scarce commodity, but the control of speed is a structural necessity in capitalist production, distribution, and innovation. So at the turn of the 20th century, when Cold War has given way to marketplace, BG Garment was one among the fastest capitalists to capitalize on this change of time by moving its production site to the border town A. With the support from the Thai state and in response to the global restructuring, this frontier area has become one of the largest subcontracted sites in the global supply chain, where thousands of war refugees were now turned into a reserve army of labor, ready to work for very low wages in the emerging garment industries. Similar to outsourcing industry elsewhere, the growth of the outsourcing in garment industry in this small town represents a flight from labor, as it provides an opportunity to escape regulated labor market and unionized workforces, which allow these firms to operate on a global basis without committing to a specific places, labor forces, or societies. So the rise of subcontracted capitalism in Town A has also shifted the grammar of corruption. Prior to the advent of transnational garment subcontracted industry and the subsequent mushrooming of local subcontracted business, bribery was already a massive enterprise, a primitive form of exchange in which bribe was carried out to regulate the flow of illicit things and commodities such as illegal timber, drugs, and consumer products from the Burmese border. The operation that was significant to frontier capitalism. As the manager of BG Garment explained, and I quote here. So you can see the timber was quite a huge and luxurious kind of business back at the time. Corruption in border town A began as a necessity, a response to a lack of access to market economy of timber after the nationwide logging ban in 1989 that immediately caused an influx of illegal logs into the country, especially from the neighboring borders of Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar. But the second stage of corruption in Town A, however, has to do with an access to the enigmatic world of bureaucracy in regulating undocumented migrant workers. So on the one hand, the Thai state had encouraged Thai and foreign investors to relocate their industry into the border area since 1992, designated the area as border industrial zone and gateway to ASEAN in 2012, and a special economic zone in 2014. Key to this transformation is the state fixing of two elements to serve the interests of the capitalists, which is fixing the wage at low level. So here, in this area, the wage is second lowest in the country. And fixing the mobility of migrant workers. So according to the state regulation, they are only allowed to work on two categories, which are labor and housemaid. So access to work only through recruitment under MOU channel, and free or independent labor is illegal. So this is to ensure that there would be sufficient cheap labor for the emerging industry, which have grown excessively in the area. For local brokers, on the other hand, their focus is different from that of the state. Their job is to make sure that every migrant worker is in the record, forms are filled, fees are paid. All these are to ensure that the routine procedure towards legality is in place. Sounds familiar, huh? Unlike the temporality of the capitalist, the bureaucratic time does not follow acceleration. It's not even in the bureaucratic vocabulary. So the early years of the bureaucratic registration scheme of undocumented migrant workers were filled with confusion and frustration, as various different kinds of forms, documents, cards were produced. And the whole process of paperwork, both the application and the renewal, was not open year-long, sometimes once in every 2 years. So as a result, those migrant workers who missed the deadline or employers who forgot to bring their workers to the district office in time to get the approval paper, their status would automatically turn illegal. Walking on the street without a proper document, a migrant worker would risk extortion or arrest by the police Hiring migrant workers with outdated or expired documents, a factory owner would also risk being fined at the rate as high as 10,000 or even tens of thousands, depending on how many workers he or she has. So the clash between capitalist calm and bureaucratic indifference has given rise to both coercive practice of extortion and patronage, relationship of bribery. Both forms of corruption work together to mediate the tension between the capitalist demand for low-wage, immobile, continuous, and speedy workforce and the world of bureaucratic routines. So when I first began my fieldwork on bribery in Town A, business owners would be reluctant to give an interview when I use the term sway or sinbon. Literally means bribery. Whenever I use a term to inquire them about their relationship with local authorities in that different area, they would refuse to give interview. So at one point, an owner of a middle-sized food processing factory corrected me that, don't call it sway. For me, I see it as a way of taking care of, ดูแล. So it is a way of taking care of social welfare in the area. So for people there, the term sway definitely has a negative connotation that they would not want to associate with. I realized later on that it was actually the local authority themselves who used the term ดูแล or ช่วยดูแล, help taking care of, in their communication with their clients. As an owner of a ready-to-wear factory told this story to me. So they would come and ask tactically whether we would like to be taken care of. In the beginning, so, her workers not legal, so she had no choice but to let them come and take care of her and her business. So the discourse of caring as a form of patron-client relationship developed in the border town A is by no means unique to Thai society. Some scholars of corruption studies argue that corruption is likely to proliferate during the initial stages of capitalist development, when capitalists have the benefit of low legitimacy and states encounter excess demand for the rights and resources they allocate. Different kinds of patron-client network result in different kinds of rights exchanged through corruption, and the terms of what have been exchanged. For the emerging border capitalist class in Town A, while the right to access trans-border labor force has been crucial to their capital accumulation, the price of ค่าดูแล has become increasingly costly. Right has become involuntary and onerous. As a representative of an industrial organization recalls his own experience. So for the big business, it costs as much as millions. For medium and small business enterprises, the bribe rate is smaller depending on the number of workers in the factory. There are 5 or 6 groups of government officials to whom they have to pay monthly. It is interesting to note that those who pay bribes don't necessarily know bribe collectors and sometimes have no clue who they represent, as they usually wear casual clothing and come in private cars and never introduce themselves. But bribe collectors know the business they come to collect the money well. Each of them would have a notebook that contains the list of all the factories in the town, their locations, sizes, and total numbers of migrant workers in each factory, as well as the amount of bribe to be collected. So there were so many stories of how each of this industry or business, got into this bribery business. Like this one, this person even asked the guy who came to collect the money, shouldn't you be working? Why do you use official time to collect money? And I think he probably answered in his silence that I'm doing my job. And here's another one. Okay, so There are several kinds of bribery being done in the area. A medium-sized garment factory owner whose workers were also arrested because she forgot to renew their work permit came to a conclusion that paying a lot of bribes does not necessarily guarantee total safety from being arrested. Because if you pay organization B and C and E each month, it doesn't guarantee that some of the organization or official A and B would not come to arrest you. You pay organization A, people from organization A might not bother with you, but organization B and C, once in a while they would come because they have to, in Thai we call ทำยอด. ทำยอด means the central organization, right, will demand that each year you have to make a target of combating corruption. That means you have to send in the numbers of organization of business that you raid, and then you arrest someone in order to send the number back to them. So some like this one complain that how come that she pays so many organization and it costs a lot each month, but she still got arrested. But the organization officials said that it doesn't work that way. If you drive on the street without driving license, then you can get away from it. But in terms of workers, that's a different story. So after a decade long of paying the fee for caretaking, most business came to realize that the care they have paid for is contingent and has certain limit. A bribe paid to one organization doesn't necessarily cover other organizations. Furthermore, cracking down on illegal labor is still carried out once or twice a year in response to the central government policy to combat corruption. So as a result, some business, mostly large-scale factories, would put all efforts to find an alternative system of regulating labor that would serve both purposes of preventing the mobility of workers and lowering the minimum wage level. So to solve the problem with expensive price and inefficiency of bureaucracy, the industrial organization pressured the government to enforce an alternative regulation for migrant documentation that allow for short-term labor, specifically for those living in border areas known as Section 64 of the Royal Ordinance on Foreign Worker Arrangement. This new regulation allows factory owners to hire workers under seasonal permit that lasts for 30 days and is renewable. Although this new system of labor management has allowed capitalists to get away from the weak registration system and bribery, it has created a new condition of precarity for migrant workers. In some cases, employers would continuously renew the short-term seasonal work contract instead of signing proper employment contracts in order to avoid responsibility of welfare coverage to legally register migrant workers. There are also cases of employers who force workers with legal documents under MOU system to switch to short-term seasonal contracts. As precariousness have increasingly come to characterize the lives of transnational migrant workers, moral practices of bribery have become an option for them to take flight from being confined as the industrial reserve army. So what do bribery and border share in common? One, two, three. They both are characterized by transgression. Rule crossing and regulation violation are norm rather than aberrants that generates collusive relationship significant to capital accumulation, not only among the capitalists but also the marginal other. So in the borderland of town A, bribery redraws the social landscape of the town, creates its new rule while reproduces the unequal power relation and exploitation, which in turn allows room for maneuver among the powerless migrants. Historically, border town A has long been a trading town between local people living on both sides of the border. In several markets in the town, local products are sold by both Burmese and Thai traders who occupy different space but juxtaposed to each other. Some of the traders are Muslim who have lived in town A for a long time and thus have Thai citizenship. But the majority of the Burmese traders are former migrant workers who rent the store in the market from their Thai counterparts, the act which deemed illegal. Some transnational migrants from neighboring countries are allowed only to work as low-wage contracted workers or housemaids. So to free themselves from low-wage work for upward mobility, one has no choice but to engage in bribing connection. Store rental rate in the market varies depending on the size and location. The lowest rent is 2,000 baht a day or 1,000 baht for a half day. The highest rent is 7,000 baht with the best spot in front of the market. I believe, in this area. So a young female who has taken over the right to rent a store that her mother has had since the time it was still an old market, said to me that her mother has been a trader in the Thai market for almost 20 years. And she has now returned home to Myanmar. In the past, she used to pay 500 baht per month to only official A, but over the last couple of years, she also had to pay an additional fee to official B, which is from a different organization for another 300 baht. Every store run by a non-Thai will all have to pay. Otherwise, it will risk being arrested with a very expensive fine. So when I asked a trader whether she knows the difference between the two kinds of fees she has to pay, she said for official A, maybe the fee probably relates to her status as a non-Thai. And for official B, it might relate to the products she is selling, which is mostly Burmese items from across the border. But these are all guessing. It is interesting to note that the discourse of bribery as operating among the Burmese migrants does not revolve around the notion of taking care of. It is a straightforward, compulsory deal of to pay or to get arrested. So unlike the Thai capitalists who can seek other options to escape from bribery relationship, bribe is mandatory for Burmese migrants, the same way as their assigned category of an alien worker or แรงงานต่างด้าว Bribe collecting is usually done by newly recruited Thai officials or otherwise Muslim migrants in the area who are usually hired by Thai officials to do a translation job. A trader explains that bribe collectors are the people who are much disliked by traders at the market. As a result, no Burmese would want to do the job. Thai officials won't do it themselves. If they do, they would come and call the trader to come to their car and give them cash. Not only traders who are targeted for bribing, but also auto rickshaw drivers, construction contractors, food shop sellers, grocery store owners, all kinds of occupations are pushed into the network of bribery. Some occupations, such as rickshaw driving, which is the job reserved only for Thai nationals, believe it or not, drivers have to pay at least 5 organizations. According to one auto rickshaw driver I interviewed, the amount he pays monthly is as high as 3,000 baht. Although the earning is not very high, it is more reliable than the previous construction work he did. Employment in construction work tends to be volatile and unstable. Sometimes a period of being unemployed can last very long and make it difficult for migrant workers to endure as they have to pay rents and pay for a living. So an owner of a food store gave an answer about how she has to pay a monthly bribe to government officials. That, they came to live in their country, so when they came to ask for the money, we have to give them the money. So although the practice of bribery intends to leave no tangible trace of the relationship for anyone to track down, it does drop some strange symbolic material for their clients to ponder upon. I'll give you some example. No trader knows exactly what all these symbols mean. Even the phone number. Even the phone numbers, when they try to call, no one pick up the phone. Maybe these are some codes known only among the bribe collecting officials to indicate their turf. Or maybe they mean to be a receipt. No one really knows. Or maybe this is a symbolic way of making an apology of what they have done. That's why they put sorry on it. Only the bribe collector knows, but no one, none of the traders there to ask them. Bribery imposed on Burmese migrants, however, did not promise full protection at all times. So similar to what the Thai capitalists have experienced. Paying bribe to official A and official B doesn't guarantee that there will no longer be a market rate for an illegal occupation. So although bribery is designed to evade the rigidity of bureaucracy, local officials still have to respond to the bureaucratic routine of making the target set by the central organization, as I said before, the term tham yot. To compensate for this contradiction, in the month that there will be a roundup, there will be no bribe being collected by official B. So that's a nice morality of corruption here. This exemption does implicitly sends a message of warning to market traders that there's a possible rate that will take place in any day of the month, so be prepared. So come to the last type of corruption, which is extortion. Of all the various kinds of corruption, extortion is considered by migrant workers the most exploitative and intolerable. It is irrational, arbitrary, and violent. Unlike other forms of corruption, street extortion does not generate any kind of pattern-client relationship, nor does it have any element of a change of access or right. In the border town A, checkpoints are set up at whim, while extortion reflects racial prejudice against the marginal Burmese migrants. Government authorities in their uniforms will stand in areas where migrant workers usually commute, either to work or to transport to other cities, or to buy food, such as at the central part of the town, near the bus stop, or at the junction of the market. They would stop Burmese migrants to check for identification documents. If the victim doesn't have proper document, the usual process of extortion then begins. So there were stories and stories about this by this woman, and then her husband as well. The culture of extortion represents a way in which the border town A has been mapped into the geography of surveillance, made possible by the control of migrant identification documents. Identification document becomes the means in which the notion of alienness has been materialized and mapped onto the migrant's body. The process in which anthropologist Reddy describes as paper becomes people. The presumption about personhood that shape an unmade legal status. Such process of documentary practices thwarts legal status from the personhood of the people. This explains why, in a lot of cases, despite the legal status a migrant worker has, he or she is still subject to extortion. So I would like to argue further that the separation of legal status from personhood, which renders legal status irrelevant to the holder, has also oftentimes been realized and recognized and sometimes internalized by migrant workers themselves, which in a way helps reproduce the legitimacy of extortion itself. In an interview with a Burmese who worked as an agricultural laborer in another district nearby the border town A, he recalls the time when he visited town A and was extorted by two local officials on the street. Despite the fact that he has all the proper documents presented to the local authority, they still ask for 400 baht money. Instead of insisting on his legal status, this migrant simply gave the official the money they requested. And he explained that he didn't want to have trouble. ไม่อยากมีเรื่อง The answer reflects very well his understanding of the politics of extortion. It works through the logic of race rather than legal status. So what do they do then? Well, taking flight is one way powerless people redraws the official map and turns it into vernacular form of everyday border struggle. This phenomenon is by no means distinctive, as shown in various border studies. The heterogeneous tactics of bordering and the striving for freedom of movement are fundamental to the global border regime that has problematized not only the notion of border, but also the construction of national and regional identity as well. Border negotiation in border town A involved migrants adopting a number of tactics to subvert the state control of their mobility. Migrant cartography represent the everyday mobile practices that redraw the topography of the migrant social world, both deconstructing the map of the powerful authority and reconstructing the everyday cartography of survival. So different migrants with different resources draw on distinctive spatial and identity tactics. A precarious migrant without any documents would go to work very early in the morning and return home after sunset to avoid unnecessary encounters with the government official. Most migrants know the usual spots on the main street. I think I have it here. Where the authority conduct inspections. Migrants' geography of movement does involve the routing of diverse alleys and small lanes to their workplace that might take longer but are easier to escape. A motorcycle that drives against the right lane direction might signal a police, a local authority checkpoint ahead. A small-scale contractor would carefully select a job that is not located on the main street or at a location that would attract authorities' attention. To evade an extortion bribe, a migrant grocer would leave the door of his grocery home half open, while keeping drinks and goods in the refrigerator and boxes. Regular customers would know this trick and pick up the goods they need even in the owner's absence. So employing a broker is another strategy a migrant resorts to in order to sidestep the complicated process of bureaucratic documentation. During the time when migrants were prohibited from changing employers, hiring false employers became a widespread business in the border town. The so-called employer broker or นายหน้านายจ้าง would act as an employer with his or her name indicated on the migrant ID card. If a migrant is caught by an authority engaging in a prohibited business, an employer broker would come to rescue his or her client by assuring the migrant worker status of employment and negotiating with the authority. Movement and struggles of the migrants call attention to the paradoxes of conflict and compliance, subjective claims and objective identification that crisscross the field of precarity and problematize the idea of fixed citizenship. While coercive extortion works to reproduce the boundaries between the state and non-citizenship and between inside and outside the law, moving in and out of various forms of corruption and illegal brokerage allow migrant others to obscure their boundaries. It also reflects migrants' differentiation between acceptable bribery and unjust street extortion, the moral aspect of corruption, and the migrants' response to norms and rules imposed by state agency. While certain cultural codes are imposed by the bribing agency to govern the way corruption is exercised at the border, those rules are often negotiated or contested. Such engagement allows the marginal people to reimagine the state and the relationship they have with the Thai nation state beyond the restricted confinement. And I will come to conclusion here. So in this talk, I have shown how an anthropology of corruption could contribute to a deeper understanding of corruption practices beyond the state-centric framework. Political economists and policymakers alike often see an enforcement of law and regulation as the only way to combat corruption. I have argued in this talk that it is rather opposite. In the case of migrant labor management, corruption has been developed alongside the enforcement of the law. Similar to what Akhil Gupta found in his studies about corruption as a means to understand the blurring of the boundary between state and society, my observation at the border points to the constant movements in and out of public and private arenas, or formal and informal relationships in the border world of corruption. Official uniform and discourse of law were often used in the practice of street extortion with undocumented migrant workers. However, the same authority might then shift his communication to an idiom of informal language of caretaking and protection while wearing a casual uniform in collecting bribes from its clients in factories and markets. It is the blurring of these boundaries between the state and corruption that allows corruption to operate as an integral part of Thai society. So any policy to solve the corruption problem at the border, we need to situate corruption both in a larger context of political economic changes and in the dynamic of power relationship in the social world of borderland. 4 points need to be taken into consideration here. First, in terms of context, the rise of border corruption cannot be separated from the development of the global chain of garment and other subcontracting industries, in which capital accumulation is achieved through the exploitation of migrant labor. Second, structural condition. The paradox between the mobility of capital and fixity of labor's mobility, which is complicated by bureaucratic processes of identity document regulation, provides a condition for bribery to thrive. Third, power relation. Racial discrimination against ethnic migrants as second-class citizens and alien others help perpetuate violent treatment towards migrant workers, especially in the form of street extortion. And lastly, the everydayness of bribery reveals a contradictory view towards morality. While corruption has often been perceived as an individual lack of ethics and morality, corruption at the local level cannot be viewed only as a personal product of greed, but a structural process that tends to reproduce the existing moral world of pattern-client relationship. The morality which is not always conformed by border capitalists and migrant workers. So solving the problem of corruption at the border requires not another law to manage or control migrant labor. Rather, what is needed is a structural change that would allow migrant workers rights and access equal to citizens of the country, treating the migrants as full human beings who can have freedom to live their lives and to cultivate the potentiality in their engagement with the society they live in, are key to redefine the relationship between the state and its non-citizen other. Such structural change would not only close the possible loophole that allows corruption to arise, but would also end the condition that allow exploitative relationship and discrimination to flourish. Thank you.